Hello and welcome to this HRD Connect podcast. I am delighted to introduce Angus Ridgway, CEO and founder of Potential Life. Angus is joining us today on the phone to share his expertise on leadership and digital disruption. So Angus, the world is changing rapidly, technology is advancing, and we can see the impact of automation and artificial intelligence in products we use every day. How have you seen these changes affect the workplace, and what is the impact on people and the way companies are working?
So, I think the important thing here is to realize that the way that work is being organized has changed fundamentally. We can see this over the last 20 years or so, and this will continue as we go forward. And the important idea to have in mind is that we used to have a role-based way of organizing work. In other words, individuals had a clear role definition at work, and those roles sat together in a system that we call the organization. And this was the overall meta view of organization that's been in place for, let's say, the last 50 years or so. And in this old world, stability was important, and so it was important to do the role you were given, because doing something other than that role would make the system less efficient. Now, because of various factors that include technology, that include regulation, and that include globalization, we now find ourselves in a world where things move very, very quickly, and organizations are changing all the time. And one of the consequences of this is that the role-based way of organizing work doesn't really work anymore, because by the time you've defined those roles, you probably need to redefine them. And so we find ourselves in a shift away from the role-based view of work to more of an attitude-based view of work. In other words, people are starting to say more and more, we need people with a certain attitude set. We need people who are purposeful, who are self-regulated, who are empowered, who trust each other, who collaborate, who are able to take risks. And that's a new way of responding to this rapidly changing world of work. In other words, we need individuals who are not leaders of change, who are not people necessarily just driving change, but individuals who are leaders in change, who are able to lead in an environment of permanent change.
What do you think is needed for organizations to succeed in this rapidly changing digital environment?
Well, the first thing they need to do is to recognize that this world has changed, and that we're also on a continuing journey of change. So the direction of travel is continuing, and it's important to sort of ask ourselves a very important question, which is that in an AI world, which is the world we're heading towards, if a piece of work is codifiable or repeatable, then it will be done by a robot in the future. And so that raises a very interesting question, is, what will the work that's left for us actually look like? And when you think about it in those terms, you kind of start saying to yourselves, well, the work that will be left for us humans will be the difficult stuff, the stuff that requires judgment, that requires creativity, that requires energy. In short, the human dimension of work will go from being a nice-to-have add-on to a work task to becoming the very essence of what work will be in the future. So the most important thing is to just, first of all, internalize and embrace the enormity of the transition that's underway.
Do you see any problems with the way conventional solutions address these issues?
Well, I think conventional solutions were designed for an era where work was role-based and stable. And so you tended to have solutions that were focused on building skills so that people could execute their tasks or their roles well in the stable environment. And so as a result, you tended to put people in classrooms and teach them so that they could develop those skills. I think, now I'm not saying that skills aren't important. Of course, skills are important. But what is important to realize about the world that we've headed into is, in addition to skills, it's the attitudinal side of leadership that's important. And when you think about the attitudinal side of things, conventional types of solutions, in other words, classroom-based solutions, don't really help people shift their attitudes. The way in which you help people shift their behavior sets or their attitudes is by accompanying them on a journey that takes time, that actually happens in context. In other words, and by in context means, for example, you are at work as you're doing it rather than in a classroom. And also understands how, as human beings, we actually change our behaviors and recognizing that we have to get to the point where we actually start to ritualize change, to change our habits. Even if we may start by experimenting and making small changes, ultimately it's when we get to the point of changing our habits through ritualization that lasting change actually happens. And that requires a totally different type of intervention in the organization.
In your book, The Joy of Leadership, you talk about 10x leaders and the ability for anyone to cultivate traits and ways of thinking to become happier, more effective and more successful leaders. Can you tell me a little more about what these traits are and how people might adopt these behaviours?
Yes, so in our book, basically what Tal and I did was to codify and to consolidate what the science of success tells us about the most successful, flourishing people today. And what we've put in the book is grounded in positive psychology. So positive psychology is the science of flourishing, well-being, and happiness. It's a scientific movement that's been around for around 25 years and was grounded in a very simple but powerful idea. And that idea was the following: happiness is not simply the absence of sadness. Now, why was that idea so important? The idea was important 25 years ago because until then, psychology was essentially preoccupied with helping people resolve their internal conflicts, so their mental challenges. And they said, that's fine, but there are degrees of happiness. Happiness can be codified. And from there was born positive psychology. Now, what we did was to consolidate that body of research into something that's accessible so that we can all draw on this in our day-to-day lives. And we see five domain areas, or 5 themes, if you like, that explain most of the variance, most of what you see when you see these successful people. The first is strength. So recognizing that whilst most of us think that the way to progress is by fixing our weaknesses, and the reason why we think that way is because we've been conditioned, starting at school, to understand that we need to fix our weaknesses. This is the path to success. The science actually tells us that that's not just a little bit wrong. In fact, it's totally wrong. Of course, you do need to look after your weaknesses, but if you want to do something that's truly special, you have to be spending some of your time doing what you're truly good at. In other words, playing to your strengths. For most individuals, that's a challenge because we haven't been raised to think about our strengths. We haven't been raised to cultivate and to use our strengths. So it requires quite a transition in terms of how we go about what we go about. So that's the first area, strengths. The second area has to do with health, which relates to energy and stress. And the important thing here is to offer a different view about how we relate to work, non-work, and stress and recovery. The prevailing review is that we need to manage our work-life balance. In other words, somehow work is the thing that stresses us. We need balance, so it's outside of work that we recover from work. And by balancing these two things together, that we will be okay. But as we all know, there are many things in work that stress us, but there are also many things outside of work that stress us. And there are many things outside of work that are sources of recovery, but also there are many things at work that are sources of recovery. So in reality, it's much more complex patchwork than that. And so the alternative view about stress and recovery is not that somehow stress is bad and therefore we need an antidote to it, but actually recognize that much of stress is actually good for us. It helps us focus, it makes us more creative, it helps us engage positively with other people. Of course, there are boundaries and limits, and that we need to find a way of embracing stress as a positive. And the way to do this is to see that it's our energy level, it's the taking responsibility for the proactive management of our energy levels that allows us to embrace stress. In other words, when we are feeling energized, we can actually embrace stress as a positive. When we are feeling drained, we can't cope with stress. So take responsibility for managing our energy. The third area has to do with the fact that we're also distracted all the time. So we can relate this to mindful engagement or even meditation, and it has a very detrimental effect on our personal productivity, also in terms of how we lead other people. For example, if somebody's talking to you, and even maybe they're actually looking at you, but you can sense that their eyes are, or their mind is somewhere else, that's not a great way to be led. It's not a great way to be talked to. And so mindful engagement is a massive driver of personal productivity, leadership, and overall life satisfaction. So that's the third area. The fourth area has to do with what types of relationships actually matter most in the fast-moving networked world that we operate in today. And we recognize that there are two factors that really matter here. Positivity and authenticity. Positivity is how much positive energy are you leaving behind you in your interactions with other people. And authenticity is how true to yourself are you being in those interactions, how much of a facade is there in those interactions. And for many of us, it's difficult to manage both of these at the same time. So, for example, if we're in a face-saving culture, we tend to oppose positivity and authenticity. We tend to think that if I'm going to have to be authentic, that somehow implicitly assumes I'm going to be negative at the same time, or I'd rather be positive at the expense of being authentic. In other words, that's a face-saving behavior. The opportunity here is to recognize that it is possible to be both positive and authentic at the same time, and this is what the most successful people do in terms of how they relate to their networks. And the fifth and final factor has to do with purposeful living, recognizing that what's important here is not so much the question of the meaning of life, although that, of course, is an interesting question, but rather to ask yourself, what am I doing to put meaning into my life? And here, the idea of reframing what we do, taking the most small and utterly meaningless thing that we do, and reframe to find the meaning in what we're doing. And by doing so, taking responsibility for putting meaning into our lives every day. So these five domain areas, which we call strength, health, absorption, relationships, and purpose, together create, if you like, a formula where, and by applying these things, we can all make small changes to how we live our lives. By doing so, live a more flourishing existence and be a stronger leader as we flourish in this rapidly moving world.
Finally, Angus, what are the requirements for successful leadership development, and how can companies harness the untapped potential of their employees?
So if you take what I've just described to you, that's a promise of an attitudinal shift. If only we can help our people do this, and by doing so be, if you like, on fire individuals. In other words, bring the best version of themselves to work every day. So that's the promise. Just imagine what your organization might be like if you had people who are bringing the best version of themselves to work every day, if they were on fire at work every day. I think the important thing to here is to recognize that the method of intervention is going to be different to what most people would have seen to date. Because what we're trying to do here is bring around large-scale attitudinal shift in an organization in order to move the needle on culture. Some of the important things to think about. First thing is to think in terms of small changes making a big difference. So this idea that when it comes to making big unitary changes, we all tend to recoil in horror. But if we make lots of small changes, we can actually accumulate them up and actually lead to large change. That's one important thing. The second idea is to recognize that all of this has to take place in context. In other words, it's at work that these changes actually need to happen. So try and have an intervention method that actually takes place in context at work. The third idea is to recognize that this takes time, If you're going to go through a behavioral change methodology, which probably starts with experimentation and then maybe perhaps through some cognitive thinking about what actually do I want my profile to be, and then culminates in a adoption of new habits through a process of ritualization, this will take time, and in our methodology actually takes 9 months. And then perhaps the final principle is to recognize that you can't just think your way to leadership here. This is not a cognitive thinking exercise. This is actually an experiential approach. And so people actually have to be trying new things out week in, week out. It's not about learning stuff. It's actually about doing stuff, practicing stuff. And the important thought here is to recognize that sometimes it's our actions, it's when we try things out that actually inspires how we think about things. It's not just our reflections or how we think about things, but it's a necessary condition for action. And so what that means is you have to just try stuff. And then when you try stuff, that actually changes how you think about stuff. And then you try some more stuff, and that changes. So actually in the verse, the received wisdom, that somehow it's reflection that leads to action, rather it's your action that actually inspire the reflection.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Angus. It was fantastic to have you with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Potential Life, along with a multitude of other thought leaders in the HR and learning space, will be joining the HRD Summit next year. To see more content from them and others, please visit our website at hrdsummit.com.